This lesson today is your learning objective is to understand significant figures. Now before we start, can you make sure you're sitting somewhere quiet? Can you make sure you've got a pen or a pencil and some paper? Okay, so what we're going to do is, can you put on your paper, write down LO to understand significant figures, and can you underline that? Okay. Now, the success criteria for this lesson is that I can identify significant zeros, because that's going to be important, and I can identify non-significant zeros. So before we start, we've got a knowledge retrieval activity here, 6 questions, and you've got about 10 minutes to answer those 6 questions, and then I'll come back to you with the answers. So you can pause the video now and do the knowledge retrieval. Okay, here's the answers to the knowledge retrieval. So if you haven't got a green pen, even try and find a different coloured pen. At least if there's any that you couldn't do, at least write down the answers that we've given for you. We're going to look at non-significant zeros. So there's 3 different types of non-significant zeros. To the left of the first non-zero digit in an integer or a decimal. Okay, that might sound quite complicated, but what that means is the number 029. We wouldn't normally write 029, we would just write 29. So we can, that first 0 is not significant or insignificant. Also, if it's a decimal, 0.001, when we're rounding to one significant figure, then the 0.00, we don't count them because they're not integers. To the right of the last non-zero digit in a decimal, so 13.4000, we don't need those 3 zeros after the 4, so they're insignificant or not significant. To the right of the decimal point, where there are no non-zeros in the decimal, so those 2 zeros in front of that 1 are non-significant, just like in the example of the question 1. Here are some examples of significant and non-significant figures. So this one is mixing them up, okay? So look at example 1. 0.09 has got 2 non-significant zeros. So if I was to round that to one significant figure, I would ignore those 2 zeros and I would put 0.09. We can't include those. Example 2, 0.009 has got 3 non-significant zeros or insignificant. Okay, so, and it goes on. Okay, I'm just going to draw your attention to the examples of non-significant zeros to the right of the last non-zero digit in a decimal. So example 1, 0.09000. Those 3 zeros aren't doing anything, so they're not significant. And example 2 is the same, and 3 and 4. In example 4 and 5, and even 3 and 2 and 1, the 0 in front of the 9, they're placeholders, so they're important. So that 0 in example 1, that 0 in front of the 9 is a placeholder, so it's important. In this page there are some examples of non-significant zeros where there are zeros to the right of the decimal point. So again, example 1 is 9.000. Those 3 zeros are not important. Example 2, 90.00. Okay, so that 0 after the 9 but before the decimal point in example 2, that number is 90. Okay, so you just think about it, if someone owed you £90 and they says we'll round it off and I'll give you 9, you wouldn't be very happy about only getting £9. So that 0 after the 9 is very important. Example 3, 19.000. Those 3 zeros aren't significant because they're after the point. Example 4, the 2 zeros after the point are not significant, but the 0 after the 9 is important because it's 190. And example 5, the 3 zeros after the point are not important. Right, we're going to do some I do's and we do's. So first of all, I'm going to do the I do. And what we're going to do is we're going to underline the non-significant zeros, thinking about what we've just learned. So I'm looking at this 0.008, and I can remember reading that it said the zeros before the first integer, so the first digit is 8. So those two zeros before the 8, they are non-significant, so I am going to underline them. Okay. Then the next I do 0.008100. So the non-significant zeros are the ones before the 8 and also the ones after the 1. Okay, so what you're going to do now is you've got 1 minute or longer. You can pause the video. So if you pause the video, and then I will reveal the answers to the we do. So use your green pen or your different coloured pen to check that you've got that right. You should have underlined the first 3 zeros in the 8-1, and you should have first underlined all the zeros in the 0.00100. Now I'm going to do 0.1. So 0.1, the 0 is non-significant. 10.00, so the 0, if I didn't include the 0 after the 1, it would just be 1. So it's only the 2 zeros after the point that are not significant. Okay, so you pause the video and you do the 2 we do's. Okay, the answers, you should have underlined the 2 zeros because they're both not significant, and on the next one you should have underlined the 2 zeros after the point because the 0 and the 0 after the 1, they're placeholders. They make that number be 100. So we're going to continue looking at significant and non-significant figures. So up until now we've looked at non-significant zeros and talked a little bit about the ones that were significant. So the significant zeros are when they're between a non-zero digit and a decimal point. So that sounds quite complicated, but we'll explain it. They're between non-zero digits in an integer and a decimal. So example 5400.00. Those 2 zeros after the 54, they are really important. Okay, those in example 2, the 2 zeros between the 5 and the 4, they're placeholders. Otherwise that number would be 54 and not 5004. So they are significant. Example 3, again, they are placeholders. We need them there, so they are significant. So significant kind of means important. So they're important. Example 4, the 2 zeros between the 5 and 4 again are important, but the 2 before that, if we were rounding to one significant figure, we wouldn't count that 0 because it's not non-zero. And example 5, the 0 between the 2 4s. Okay, so just familiarize yourself with that and have a think of any other numbers that might have non-zero significant figures in them. Now we're going to do identify the significant zeros in 0.00980. So I'm looking at that and I'm thinking which zeros are significant, which ones are important. So there are no significant zeros in this number. Okay, so that's why there's none underlined. Then if I look at identify the significant zeros in 0.90080, There's 2 zeros after the 9 which are needed. So if I was rounding that off to one significant figure, I would round it off to 0.9. Okay, so the ones where I would underline are the 2 in the middle. Okay, then what you're going to do, you're going to do the 2 we do questions. So I'm going to give you, pause the video, and when you come back, I'll give you the answers. Okay, there's the answers for the we do question. If you haven't managed to get the same answer as what's here, then you need to go back and have a think. But the non-significant figures in this one is the 0 between the 5 and the 4. Okay, and again in that one is the 3 zeros between the 5 and the 4. Okay, so I'm going to identify the significant zeros in 0.00908. The significant zeros, there's only one of them, and it's the one between the 9 and the 8. And likewise, the significant zeros in the next I do, 0.09008, are the ones between the 9 and the 8. Okay, stop the video and you have a go at the next two. So the question said find the non-significant zeros. So there weren't any in 0.0054. So if I was rounding to one significant figure or two significant figures, I wouldn't count any of those zeros. But in 0.00504, if I was rounding to one significant figure or two significant figures, I wouldn't count the first three zeros. I would only count the one after the 5 and the 4. So you should underline the 0. Next example, identify the significant zeros in that number. Okay, so I'm looking at that number and I haven't underlined any zeros, because if I was rounding to a number of significant places, there are no significant zeros in that number. Okay, the next one, identify the significant zeros in the 0.90080. Well, there's two zeros surrounded by the 9 and the 8. So if I was rounding, I would have to count them. So I've underlined those. Okay, I'm going to pause the video and you're going to do the next two questions. Okay, so you should have got underlined the 0 between the 5 and the 4. And on the next one, you should have underlined the two zeros between the 5 and the 4, because they are significant zeros. So if you were rounding, you would have to count those zeros as significant figures. I'm going to identify the significant zeros in 98.0008. And if I was to round to three significant figures or two significant figures, those three zeros would be significant. Again, I'm going to identify the significant figures in the next number, 980.0008, and it's the three zeros after the point that are significant. So you're going to do the next two questions, the two we do's. Pause the video and then come back when you've got the answer. Okay, should have got the three zeros between the 5 and the 4. And again, you should have got the three zeros between the 5 and the 4. Give yourself 10 minutes to do these questions. Write out the number and underline the zeros which you think are significant. So remember, read the question, we're concentrating on the significant zeros. Okay, so I'll give you 10 minutes, pause the video, and then I will show you the answers on the next slide. Here are the answers that you should have got. So can you mark your work If you've got any wrong, just go back and check, see where you went wrong and correct it. Hopefully you got them all right. This lesson was to help you understand significant figures, and now you should clearly be able to identify significant zeros, and also you should be able to identify non-significant zeros, and that will make it easier for you whenever we go on to rounding to 3 significant figures or 2 significant figures. Okay, that's the end of the lesson. Thank you very much. I hope your work has been neat, and I hope you've enjoyed this lesson.